North Korea's latest missile launch has once again attracted strong condemnation. The US is seeking to impose more sanctions at the UN, while warning of possible military action. But what would further sanctions mean for North Koreans? This is Inside Story. Welcome to the programme. I'm Sohail Rahman. Now, time for diplomacy is running out. That's the message from the US to Pyongyang. On Tuesday, North Korea launched what it's believed to be its first intercontinental ballistic missile. Now, since then, the US has been reassuring its allies that it will do everything it can to protect them, and that could include the use of military force. But for now, it's planning to propose further sanctions through the UN Security Council. Now, we'll get to our guests in a moment, but first, Gabriel Elizondo sets up our discussion from UN headquarters in New York.
After the successful launch by North Korea of possibly its most destructive missile yet, more promises to try to curtail an ever-increasing nuclear threat. Agreement by diplomats on the UN Security Council that the latest launch is a troubling provocation that needs to be curtailed, but disagreement on how. Nikki Haley, the U.S. envoy, said the U.S. will look to cease trading with any country seen doing business with North Korea, but also promised even graver repercussions.
The United States is prepared to use the full range of our capabilities to defend ourselves and our allies. One of our capabilities lies with our considerable military forces. We will use them if we must, but we prefer not to have to go in that direction.
But China, North Korea's strongest ally, said no steps by any side should be taken which would exacerbate tensions.
China has always been firmly opposed to chaos and conflict on the peninsula. Military means must not be an option in this regard.
Earlier at the UN on Wednesday, non-proliferation experts from a group proposing a treaty to ban nuclear weapons also cautioned that diplomacy is the only route.
The United States is not going to get hurt if it starts throwing its military weight around against North Korea. The people who are going to suffer are the people who have a close geographical relationship to North Korea. And people have got to start thinking clearly that there is no military solution to this.
But it's clear that after this latest missile launch, that continued pressure doesn't seem to have deterred North Korea. The United States has said it will bring a new draft sanctions resolution against North Korea in the coming days, but also said that if the Council cannot reach any consensus, the U.S. is prepared to move ahead on its own in a separate direction. What exactly that could entail, nobody knows, but it almost certainly would mean an end to any diplomatic solution to this crisis. Gabriel Elizondo, Al Jazeera at the United Nations.
Well, let's bring in my guests for this programme. Joining me on Skype from Seoul is Youngshik Bong. He's a research fellow at Yonsei University Institute for North Korean Studies. And in London, Barnaby Willits-King, research fellow at the Overseas Development Institute. Good to have you with us, gentlemen, on this edition of Inside Story. Dr. Bong, let's just start with you. It's quite interesting, isn't it, that North Korea starts off by saying it's a gift to America. I mean, this missile test in theory could possibly reach the US, and that worries obviously the international community. In your opinion, what is North Korea up to right now, considering we've seen so many missile launches just in the last 6 months?
That's right. This is the epitome of the series of missile tests that North Korea has conducted in recent months. And the fact that Kim Jong-un sent such a message, which is very close to kind of mockery, shows a great deal of confidence. What North Korea wants? North Korea wants to complete its ICBM technology that can pop nuclear warheads and target anywhere inside the United States. After that, North Korea is going to agree on negotiations with the United States, not for the purpose of denuclearization, but as a disarmament talk, something very similar to the nuclear arms reduction talks between the Soviet Union and the United States during the Cold War. as equal nuclear powers.
Do you think that diplomacy, I mean, in general terms, we'll go into more detail as the programme progresses, but do you think diplomacy is really the only avenue at the moment that is feasible, considering so many experts and stakeholders are saying a military option is a complete no-no?
I wouldn't really completely rule out military options off the table because you're talking about a pair of Kim Jong-un in North Korea and President Donald Trump in the United States. I'm not comparing them in terms of, rationality, but in terms of, their idiosyncrasy as top leaders who refuse to, budge under pressure. So you cannot rule out any accidental, escalation of tension that may bring a very disastrous result on the Korean Peninsula. But you're right that the general consensus among related parties is that we have to, at least in the short term, we have to give the diplomatic negotiations a legitimate chance.
Okay. We know that this programme is not just about the politics of what's going on across the Korean Peninsula, but also the humanitarian issues and seriousness that also is concerning the international community, and both are interconnected quite obviously, and that's where Barnaby Willits-King comes into this conversation. As the diplomacy and the rhetoric increases, Barnaby, the difficulty for aid agencies and those that care about the North Korean public at the ground level, they are worried really, aren't they, about how to get aid in when recent UN reports suggest that it's getting more and more difficult when sanctions are actually imposed. I mean, there are different ways those sanctions hit the public at large in North Korea. I mean, what's your overall view, just to start with?
So the situation in North Korea is already incredibly fragile, and people, particularly in the rural areas, are already in a pretty dreadful humanitarian situation. There are existing sanctions which have a humanitarian exemption, and that means that there is aid coming into the country. I mean, very small amounts. The UN appealed for about $140 million last year and received about a quarter of that. So it's a drop in the ocean of what the country actually needs in terms of people suffering from, food insecurity, malnutrition, health issues. But the threat of an escalating situation is very alarming because there's very few international humanitarian agencies on the ground should the situation get worse.
I mean, the World Food Programme plays a very influential role there in trying to get aid to individuals when, in fact, nearly 40% of the public in North Korea, it is said, is malnourished. You say it's difficult getting aid into the country. Is that because of a logistical difficulty of getting aid into the country, or is it about buying the aid that is required to get into the country, Barnaby?
It's a combination. So the international appeal is very receives very little funding. So there's a shortage of funds for organisations like the World Food Programme actually to bring aid in the first place. There's then a number of logistical challenges of actually getting aid into the country. But I think the organisations that are allowed to operate have a reasonably good set of arrangements with the relevant parts of the North Korean government to get aid in. Obviously, the sanctions have a complicating effect on that. I think there's some unintended consequences which make it quite challenging for a lot of the organisations just to do a normal aid operation as you'd see in a lot of other countries. For example, the banking is incredibly difficult. All banks, as I understand it, that have been able to transfer funds into North Korea are no longer functioning there. So aid agencies have literally had to be carrying in bags of cash, at least in the past. So that means just running an aid operation is very complicated. Before you even start talking about, who are you getting the aid to, how are you getting it there, in a country which has a pretty crumbling infrastructure, not very, reliable roads network, and certainly in different seasons quite hard to get around in the mountainous areas.
Okay, well, let's just give our viewers at home just a little bit more background, because the G20 summit is about to start in Germany, and of course the US President Donald Trump has made a brief stop off in Poland before he heads to that summit. This is what he had to say about North Korea.
As far as North Korea is concerned, I don't know. We'll see what happens. I don't like to talk about what I have planned, but I have some pretty severe things that we're thinking about. That doesn't mean we're going to do them. I don't draw red lines. It's a shame that they're behaving this way, but they are behaving in a very, very dangerous manner, and something will have to be done about it.
Dr. Bong in Seoul, something will have to be done about it, according to the American president. We've already heard from Nikki Haley, the US ambassador to the UN Security Council, making some very strong statements overnight about what could or could not happen. How are you reading the situation about what's happening in the UN Security Council and the type of diplomacy that President Trump has to now, you might say, fulfill while he's at the G20? Because there, he will have a much wider, higher governmental audience, you might say, of all of those leaders. He can gauge their opinion, can't he, about what to do next?
Well, I don't think US President Donald Trump is really having a high hope on multilateral approaches that will bring effective solutions to the problem with nuclear North Korea. I believe that he believes in the efficacy of unilateral action, including military options possibly taken by the U.S. military, which was also echoed by the United States ambassador to the United Nations, Ms. Haley. So it'll be another last push by Donald Trump that China has to up the ante, increase the pressure on North Korea as a last chance before the United States might consider taking the matters in its own hands.
I mean, how much influence does, can I just interrupt there? How much influence does China have? Because we've been having this conversation about China's influence over North Korea for certainly the last 4 to 5 years. And we've been discussing it in depthly here on our news programs as well as Inside Story. And we still come to the same position that North Korea, belligerently, like a spoiled child, doesn't listen to China as the big brother or the parental figure. What is the dynamic of that relationship, considering that the two main leaders haven't met yet, as far as I believe?
Well, first of all, China has sufficient influence on North Korea. If China suspends its oil supply to North Korea, which is a lifeline to North Korean economy, then North Korea has to change its behavior. Having said that, China's goals with regard to North Korea is not just the elimination of nuclear weapons and ICBMs. China also wants to keep North Korea intact as a buffer zone to prevent the further advancements of the U.S. military in Northeast Asia. And China does not want regime change or regime collapse inside North Korea. So China wants to balance all these different goals with regard to North Korea.
I don't think anybody wants regime change. I think that's certainly a point that was made by the South Korean president in a statement as well, not just within the last few hours. But yet, one wonders, how do you talk to North Korea and what do they actually want from continually launching these missiles? Are they saying, look, we can defend ourselves? Or are they saying, hey, look, we have this military capability, but we won't use it if we get what we want? But we don't know what they want. It's a theme that was echoed by Governor Bill Richardson, a former Texan governor and a UN ambassador for the United States at the Security Council. What does North Korea want?
Well, all of the above. North Korea wants to complete its nuclear second strike capability so that it will get the security assurance from China and the United States. Otherwise, North Koreans believe that it might become another Saddam Hussein in Iraq or Gaddafi in Libya. You have to have nuclear weapons to protect yourself prior to engaging in any diplomatic negotiation with the United States.
Okay, let's just talk about exactly the issue of that confrontation across the border between North and South, because it's a very difficult one for many in South Korea to wonder what might happen. I want to just perhaps bring in our reporter, Kathy Novak. She's our correspondent there. She's been speaking to people in the South Korean capital, and this is what they had to say.
North Korea's missile launch is causing concern around the world, largely because it represents an advance in capabilities as Kim Jong-un's regime works to develop an ICBM that can deliver a nuclear warhead to the U.S. mainland. People here in Seoul live with the threat from Pyongyang every day, but are they more worried than usual about this latest development?
North Korean threats happen frequently, and I usually don't pay much attention. But this recent large-scale launch and the more frequent threats make me worried.
This launch changes a lot. South Korean people should be alert and cautious now.
The US president takes strong positions, so what worries me is that we don't know what will happen next, but my daily life does not seem to be affected at all.
Everyday life does go on here despite the threats from across the border. But the South Korean government does take those threats very seriously. President Moon Jae-in would prefer to engage with North Korea and find a resolution through dialogue. But he says the situation is getting worse and that he's concerned about the possibility of an armed conflict, a possibility that would be disastrous for people here in Seoul. Kathy Novak, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Barnaby Willits-King, you heard that there is always quiet concern, certainly in the south of that peninsula and in South Korea, over what's going on in the north. When you talk to aid agencies, regardless of the World Food Programme, people who are concerned, stakeholders who try to help North Korean public on the ground level, what are their main concerns when trying to raise funds for North Korea is such a hard sell?
I think there's a number of things that they're concerned about. The funding is the first one, actually to bring funds to address some of the big humanitarian challenges. And those are partly related just to this ongoing, really chronic health crisis, malnutrition crisis. People are really not, children are not growing to the height they should be. The infrastructure is struggling as well. So you have a huge problem with water supplies. Lots of waterborne infections come about because the water supply is really in bad shape, and you see that every year with sort of seasonal flooding causing problems. So the aid agencies are very worried about putting any more strain on that should the situation get worse. And the other side of it is the government in North Korea is very, very controlling of the aid. They're, unlike anywhere else I've ever visited aid programs, it's impossible for the aid agencies to talk independently to people who are affected, to monitor programs without advance warning. So it means that the norms of international humanitarian aid are very hard to follow.
Does that mean
that's not to say that there's,
does that mean that people that donate money or countries that donate money really don't know where their money has gone? Is that what you're saying as well?
I think the UN is doing a great job of doing what it can, and certainly the projects that I visited with them a few years ago, they're doing everything they can. And I think the sense informally from a number of the aid agencies is there isn't really, a big problem with aid going into the wrong places. It's going to feed children. It's going to feed pregnant mothers. I think the problem is around just making sure that it's reaching all the people who need it, or it's meeting the most high priority needs in the country. The aid agencies can't get to all parts of the country. There are a number of things. They haven't been able to do a sort of comprehensive overview of the country of, well, where are the big problems? What are the priorities? And that, apart from the political toxicity of countries not wanting to fund programs in North Korea because they're worried about being seen to be propping up this regime, that donors can't be confident that even if they give the money, that they can be sure that it's being spent in exactly the right way.
Well, it's
not to say that there's any evidence of huge problems.
No, saying that though, Barnaby, isn't it also a sort of a two-pronged problem in that the North Koreans themselves could help themselves with the aid appeal by actually showing the public or showing the international community the problems they have. But then the cynics in the wider international community are saying, why should we fund a regime, firstly, or fund a country for aid when we don't know where the money's going and there's no transparency, and that many people who want to donate or may want to donate may say, well, you know, again, we're propping up a regime that develops missile technology. That's where the money's going. I mean, there's an automatic assumption about where this money, if it's aid, is going. I mean, it is a problem that organisations that you deal with, you communicate with, have, isn't it?
It's a huge problem, and it's one of the trickiest places. I mean, this is always a problem with aid wherever you look at it. But I think the politics and the logistics of it make it particularly difficult. I talked to aid workers who had worked in Syria, and they said that working in North Korea was infinitely more difficult, more challenging, just because of these very difficult relationships with the government. At certain levels, at the local level, in the technical ministries, some good working relationships, because they're all trying to, you know, get aid, get medicine to people, feed people. But the wider context, which makes it very difficult to get funding in, does create a real challenge. I think the UN is doing, and the Red Cross and other organisations that are working there are doing the best they can. But it's a real conundrum. If they pull out, you know, what would that would also be problematic, because the small amount of aid that's getting in, you know, would no longer be there. Yeah. But there's also another really important bit of it, which is sort of having a sense of what the situation is. No one wants the situation to return to the famine conditions that there were in the 90s, where maybe as many as 1 million people perished. And part of the problem then was there was no sort of technical experts on the ground from the UN and other organisations to sort of say, hang on a minute, you know, this is getting really bad. We need to really scale up the aid. Okay. So having a presence there is really important.
It's important. Okay, let me just bring Dr. Bong back in here in Seoul. With all of the issues around aid and help for individuals, several years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, we had these 6-party talks, you know, the UN involved with the United States, with Japan, South Korea and North Korea, trying to find a way for North Korea to demilitarize, or even, dare we say it, denuclearize, in exchange for aid, a sort of a carrot and stick approach. It didn't work, it collapsed. And I remember speaking to Christopher Hill, a former ambassador from the US, who was involved in these conversations. He said it's dead in the water, it can never be resurrected. Do you think that could change, that mindset could change, and who needs to change it?
Well, the resumption of 6-party talks depends upon North Korea accepting the very premise that 6-party talks will not be about disarmament between North Korea and the United States with nuclear weapons, but it will be focused on denuclearization of North Korea. The premise that North Korea flat, refuses. I'd like to go back to the question about economic sanctions causing miserable situation among North Korean residents. I think the blame should go to North Korean leadership, because in addition to the international organization trying to provide humanitarian aid inside North Korea, the previous Park Geun-hye administration, which is extremely conservative, and the current Moon Jae-in government of South Korea made a common proposal that if North Korea agrees to make some genuine gestures for the purpose of denuclearization, then South Korean government was ready to provide massive humanitarian aid and promote inter-Korean economic cooperation. But it was North Korean leadership showing no interest. By the way, when North Korean government fired the intercontinental missile in 2014, which blew up after less than 3 minutes in the mid-air, it costed North Korea in the excess of $800 million. $800 million wasted in less than 3 minutes, which could have provided enough amount of grain to feed the entire population the whole year.
Okay, there, for the moment, it seems we will have to leave it with those stark words, and it's interesting to hear and see what will happen perhaps in the coming days about North Korea, certainly. To my guest, Dr. Youngshik in Seoul, and Barnaby Willits-King in London. Gentlemen, thanks very much for joining me on this edition of Inside Story. And thank you for watching as well. Of course, you can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, please do go to our Facebook page. That's at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Sohail, Rahman, and the Inside Story team, thanks very much for your time and your company.